Welcome everybody to today's Penn AI Tech webinar. This is the Penn Artificial Intelligence and Technology Collaboratory for Healthy Aging, which is funded by the National Institute on Aging. And today we're very happy to have with us our speaker, Dr. Sean Mooney. Dr. Mooney is the Chief Research Information Officer of the University of Washington Medicine, UW Medicine, the Director of Informatics for the Institute of Translational Health Sciences, and Associate Director of the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center, and the Interim Director of the UW Institute for Medical Data Science, and a professor in the Department of Biomedical Informatics and Medical Education at the University of Washington. As CRIO, he leads the growing research information technology team that contributes to a number of national research networks, the National Kidney Precision Medicine Project, the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center, the UW Clear Center, and others. He has a very extensive academic and informatics record of achievements. We're really happy to have him today as our speaker. And I want to remind you all that we'll get an opportunity for questions at the end of his talk. So feel free to use the Q&A feature on your Zoom to post your questions, which we'll get to at the conclusion of the presentation. So Sean, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, George, for the kind introduction. Really happy to be here. I'm slightly losing my voice, but I should be okay for the talk. I'm perfectly healthy to be able to go do this. I'm really honored to be giving this presentation today and happy to take at the end any questions that you have, and always feel free to reach out to me. What I'm going to do over the next 45 to 50 minutes is talk a little bit about my journey at the UW as CRIO and talk about where I started, what my research interests are, why I got into the area that I am, and then talk about the platforms that we're building to really study data-driven methodology within the context of healthcare, and what we're doing to put in place all the components that we need to do that. And then I'll finish up by talking a little bit about some research that we've done that leverages some of the technology that we've been putting in place. And I'll put in little research anecdotes throughout. And then if there's time, I'm a little skeptical that there's going to be time, but if there's time, I'll also talk about national cyber infrastructure that we're putting in place to support coordinating centers, largely using cloud-based technologies, such as the work that we're doing with the National Kidney Precision Medicine Project and the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center. So again, thank you very much. Let's get started. And I want to first say that I've duped you a little bit, in that I used for some of the advertising for this, I used a picture of me that is a headshot that looks kind of funny, but is also not really actually a picture of me, but a generative AI image that was built using a deep learning method that was trained using 14 selfies that I took on a trip to Europe this summer to a couple of different conferences. And what I did was just use an off-the-shelf tool to do this, and it gave me a list of headshots to do. And I was very, very impressed with the ability of a bunch, basically selfies in front of museums and other things, fancy buildings, was able to translate that into some images of me that were quite good. And I think this really, as you think about this technology could be applicable to patients, to healthcare providers, and to human health just in general, as we all know. So I'm trained actually as a chemist and a geneticist, very interested in rare genetic diseases and heritable diseases. As you all know, there's, as many of you probably are aware, there's between 5,000 and 8,000 rare diseases, and it's much more than any individual provider can diagnose. 25 to 30 million Americans have a rare disease, depending on how you count. And many of those rare diseases have a genetic component, and finding and interpreting the human genome and the pathogenic genetic variants that sit on that genome is really critical to understanding human genetic diseases as a whole. And of course, we can do that by leveraging the human genome that was published 20 years ago and gives us a draft template by which we can map new genome sequencing of humans, both for the purposes of research and for the purposes of clinical care, and then all of the other things that we do with, like, say, direct to consumer genetic sequencing or genotyping. We can use AI to do this. So to identify pathogenic genetic variants. And this is what I've spent most of my career doing. There's a significant interest in silico identification of genetic variants. Machine learning methods can identify pathogenic variants by basically taking a database of pathogenic disease variants that cause disease and a database of benign variants that are likely not to cause disease. And if we look at a gene that has a new variant in a patient or a research participant that we don't know is benign or pathogenic, we can ask the question, does it look more like the benign variants or the pathogenic genetic variants, using machine learning and features derived from genomic and proteomic attributes about that, about the context of that variant in the human genome. And to that end, we've built machine learning methods. We've published them. We've been doing this for well over 20 years now, collaborating with Peja Radovoyats and I at Northeastern University. We've published nearly 40 papers together jointly in this space with the goal of building machine learning methods that can support clinical geneticists to interpret human genomes to make their job easier. And then if you read the paper, you'll see an ROC curve that looks something like this. This is very typical of these approaches where we build machine learning algorithms that are used either from a research perspective or eventually for a clinical perspective. And basically our reviewers demand this, where we compare our method to a bunch of other off-the-shelf methods that we can show that our method is the best, and maybe compare it to an independent set that is completely separate from the set that was used for training. This is very, very typical approach that groups have been taking for a long time, and we have seen a lot of this kind of effort in the world of healthcare, where someone has some set of data. They take that data, they use it to build some sort of machine learning algorithm or AI method. We then evaluate that method, building those ROC curves that I mentioned, and then we write a paper showing how we built that method and what the accuracy of that method, was. But many questions are unanswered. We don't know what changes with the use of this algorithm. We know that providers, provider geneticists use this to help interpret use these types of algorithms to help interpret genomes, but we don't know whether that improves our ability, that improves patient care. We don't know if that improves provider satisfaction with the use of computers. We don't know whether that costs more or less for a healthcare organization. We don't know any of the outcomes that we might expect that rises from this so-called traditional model. So what happens when a model is implemented into a clinical workflow? Do providers use it? Does it satisfy them? Does it distract them? Do patients benefit from it? Does it show the value that was proposed clinically? Does it bring value to the health system? These are all the sort of questions that made me think was really the next step for human genetic interpretation, and then made me think more broadly. And what I did was about maybe 10 or 12 years ago, started looking for new roles where I would have a role in building the platforms that leverage clinical data or real world data to improve clinical care with the goals of studying it in practice and understanding how it works better. This is all going to come from largely a University of Washington perspective. That's where I'm a professor. That's the healthcare organization that I'm embedded in. And I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about it. So patient care at the UW. This year, the UW's budget is, I don't know, $9 billion or so. And about 50 to 60% of that budget is going to be spent treating patients. We have 4 hospitals. We have 60 plus primary care clinics, a cancer center, a trauma center, helicopters and airplanes that move, like, say, trauma patients around a very large region of the United States, a school of medicine that trains new doctors and PhDs, as well as has a large number of faculty. And we have an enterprise electronic health record system that went live in 2021 and an analytics data platform that backs that up to support the more than 1 million patients we see every year. So we have data. We've had electronic clinical systems for more than 30 years, and all of those systems generate data, and that data gets stored into a separate enterprise data warehouse. And this is not just research data, but operational data as well. We have more than 100 million pieces of text, messages between providers and patients, reports from, like, say, radiology reports, or lab reports, pathology reports, clinical narrative text, like outpatient messages, things like that. And what we do is we work really hard to make that data easier to use for research. We add social determinants of health when available and try to structure them and make them easier to compute with. Environmental determinants of health, improved outcomes data. We want to make sure we have good mortality data. We geocode those patients for population health studies, and we integrate other advanced data sets when appropriate or when we've linked them. And again, this is fully identified with a population of more than 5 million patient lives. There's a big open question now from a research perspective of real-world data versus research data. And research data has historically been collected through case report forms or other instruments that are available for collecting information about pretty much any disease. And you can see these instruments. They're available at, like, the Phoenix toolkit, where you can go and if you just Google it and go to the website, you can browse all the different types of tools that have been used in the past for collecting, research data and phenotyping data about patients. And recently, there's been a lot of interest in what real-world clinical data, or real-world evidence. That is data, like clinical data that was generated not for the purposes of research, but for the purposes of clinical care, and can be used as a secondary use for research, and often is now used for phenotyping. And there's a lot of questions about the utility of both of these types of data, the quality of both of these types of data, and how to integrate and use that data. The real-world data often requires de-identification and/or patient authorization. It can be standardized into common relational databases that can be used. I'll talk more about that in a second. And it can be used for research. At the University of Washington, I lead research information technologies, among other things. We are led by Katie Averill, the Director of Research IT at UW Medicine, and she operationally leads the work that we do. And we really have our goals in the space of, at a high level, we want to help investigators develop new methods in precision medicine and run pragmatic research studies at the point of care. We support data science for population health. We provide data services. We support analytics and building this enterprise data warehouse in terms of making it better in collaboration with our analytics team. And we support enterprise research platforms such as our CTMS, our electronic data capture system, REDCap, and other things. And we work in a large number of NIH-funded studies. So one of the areas that we really like to think about and communicate is we're really driving toward a learning health system when it comes to the use of advanced data-driven methods. And the idea is very similar to the scientific method, where we can collect data, develop methods from that data, evaluate those methods or interventions that were derived from that data, implement them, study them in place, collecting more data, and continuing that cycle. The learning health system sits, I think, between a patient-centric view of healthcare, which I would characterize in the precision medicine space, where we're using, like, say, an individual's attributes to guide and personalize their healthcare, and population health, that is the health of a population and understanding the population of, understanding the health of a population and region. And the learning health system sort of fits between that, which is patient population healthcare. So one of the first things that AI has been looked at for using, and a lot of research has been done, is clinical decision support. Very early on, we realized that computers could help prevent medical errors. It's well known that many medical errors occur, and those medical errors can be preventable. And again, the informatics community saw that opportunity to present there. But one of the things that's been an outcome of that, which is the downside to this and the trade-off, has been basically false positives, over-alerting and/or alert fatigue, where you present an alert to a provider that isn't necessary or isn't something they want to see. And if you do that a lot, they're less likely to make actions on the alerts that are actually important. And there have been a number of studies at this point. Here's one study I wasn't involved with at UCSF, which showed that there were 187 audible alarms per bed per day for ICU patients, and individual alarms can be very harmful in terms of providing quality care, since they are going to bury the good alarms or the things that really have a meaningful difference if they are acted upon. So one of the first questions we asked when I got here was sort of a thought experiment. Like, what are the things that we kind of need to have in place to be able to implement, pragmatic research on AI? And this is just sort of a list. This is something that I kind of came up with in conversations with others. Your list might differ. Be happy to talk about that. But first, we thought we needed high quality data. We needed data that was useful for machine learning, and that data should be local data about our population. But we need data governance to support that data and to support use of that data. And that data governance should be friendly to AI methods, which are very different than traditional, like, say, doing a chart review of a patient or something else. We need to have the tools to access that data, which could be either a human or a computer system or both. We needed to have computing that was HIPAA compliant. And if we wanted to implement it, we had to have software for healthcare delivery, like, say, an enterprise EHR system or an enterprise PACS system, et cetera. And we needed to be able to have technical interfaces between the data scientist and those systems, the data system and the delivery system. And then we needed compliance and governance, and the ability to make decisions about what to implement, what not to implement, and how to prioritize individual methods that might have value for the health system or maybe not. And then, of course, continuous improvement and oversight of methods after they're implemented. This is something that our whole organization thinks about, not just research. Everything I'm going to talk about is coming in from a research perspective, because as CRIO, I really want to enable research at the point of care for our investigators using technology and data. One of the first things that we did was team building. I'm going to talk about team building, and I'll talk about data access, and then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the research we're doing. So we have been building teams to help support the implementation of what I would call pragmatic research that happens at the point of care, particularly AI-driven research. And we started with patient data governance and the use of data, including the honest brokers that can provide data to investigators for the purposes of research. We are an Epic shop. Our EHR uses Epic, so some of those individuals are Epic trained and understand Epic data. Similarly, we also have a team that supports infrastructure and putting together the HIPAA-based computing that, once again, is friendly for AI, understands AI, such as, for example, the use of modern GPUs for training deep learning methods, and providing, access to those resources in both a scalable and a financially efficient way to investigators to be able to build or pilot models separately from healthcare delivery. We also do a bunch of clinical trial support things, which seems to be kind of separate. I'm not totally sure why it's separate, but it is. And I'm not going to talk about that at all today. We also run a REDCap system, which collects data, can deploy scientific or clinical instruments very easily. Also not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. And then finally, the last mile. How do we actually implement back into the EHR and make research studies that are perhaps delivering AI or devices that are based on AI back to healthcare, and make that a priority, because the operational teams that are managing and overseeing the EHR are very busy with clinical priorities. And so we felt that building this team, integrating them, would be very helpful in us being able to help implement what we'd like to do. All right, so that's kind of how we built our team structure to help support this sort of research. Now I'll talk a little bit about, and this is an ongoing activity, now I'll talk a little bit about data governance, something that's very, very important to put in place so that when a data scientist comes and says, okay, I just got an IRB that's exempt for building a machine learning model on all of your patients in your EHR, and I brought a USB stick, please give me the data. You now have a process to be able to come to the right answer, which is probably no, you can't have that data, but hopefully there are pathways where that research could be performed. We started by actually bringing together all of the leadership we felt was important. These are the stakeholders that could come together to really help make decisions about what our values are and our guiding principles, and of how we share data, and why we support research, why we support the development of new machine learning models, or whatever it is that would happen. And so we brought this committee together. We met every 2 weeks for almost a year, developed all of those, all of our interests, and developed a report. And that report was confidential and delivered to our CEO for, with recommendations for things like policy, et cetera. And the CIO approved that, and we created a new committee that essentially implements that governance. And the things that we did were the things that you might expect. We developed guiding principles around data sharing, so we know kind of what our overarching rules are that we would like to know when we share data. We identified organizational risks, and we drafted what we thought should be policies. We reviewed our notice to patient privacy practices and standardized some language around that, as well as drafting standardized data use agreements so that when we share data, we had templates to work with from the beginning. And then we worked with operations to strategize and implement that to enable this data sharing more broadly. All right, so we've been team building. We kind of had a strategy of what we thought we needed to have in place. We've been team building. We then put together data governance so that we had the ability to make decisions to share data that were machine learning friendly. And the next question was access. How do we enable investigators to have access? The simplest way is to have an honest broker, a human that can do queries on behalf of the investigator and deliver to the investigator in some approved way the data that the investigator needs to do whatever the study is that they're doing for their work. One of the things that we're huge fans of are these so-called common data models. That is a relational database that is standardized, that enables us to map or transform our clinical data into a form that makes research from multiple sites easier. We often use a data model called OMOP, which you may have heard of. You can read more about OMOP if you just Google it. There are others. PCORI has a data model that's used. There's a data model that's used underneath FHIR standards and HL7. There's lots of data models out there, but we happen to really like OMOP, and we can provide OMOP data to investigators quite easily. And if the data is not in OMOP, we can also dive down into our operational data and collect it directly there. I talk a little bit here in this slide about synthetic data. I'm going to talk more about synthetic data in a second. We're also big fans of using these standard data models to create fake data sets that look like our patients, that aren't really our patients, so that investigators like data scientists might have access to tangible relational clinical data that is not a privacy risk for our organization or our patients. We also developed self-service access to data. We built an open source application called Leaf that is very easy to install. If you have a patient-centered database, it can be used for both clinical data and research data. Basically, if you have a relational database where its key unit is a patient and a bunch of things about a patient, it's very easy to install and allow for doing both cohort discovery, data browsing, and extraction of those patients. This was developed by Nick Dobbins on my team, and it is HIPAA compliant and can be used both clinically for research and for research. And it's completely open source. It's free to use. We have a publication on it, and you can go to our GitHub to download the code if you would like. And this was supported by our CTSA, the Institute of Translational Health Sciences. So Nick is really awesome. He developed Leaf. We've supported at the UW more than 384 investigators and tens of thousands of queries for those investigators, and a number of sites have expressed interest, and many have actually implemented Leaf, not just for individual registries or data repositories, but at the enterprise level. And I should mention that this is also not a real picture of Nick. Leaf has a very nice interface. It's web-based, and it can extract and put that data into wherever the data needs to go. And if your institution allows it, it can be either fully de-identified and only de-identified. And there's also a fully identified mode, which would enable QI or other, IRB approved research where identified data is appropriate to view. Nick has gone on. He got a PhD. As part of his PhD, he developed a large language model version of Leaf, which is not quite implemented and available yet, but very close. You're watching a demo of it here as an animated GIF that's embedded in my slide, where you can take natural language about inclusion and exclusion criteria for patients, and it goes and queries the enterprise data warehouse and comes up with basically all of the cohorts based on the inclusion-exclusion criteria. And Nick, in his paper, which is published now, has shown that this method is that this approach is as accurate or even more accurate than human SQL developers who are querying the enterprise data warehouse directly. One of the areas that I think is very underserved in the data science space in the clinical world is visualization. And this is just an example. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this other than to say, if you're interested in visualization, this is a huge opportunity area because we have true big data sets at most academic medical centers at this point, with millions of patients and very little understanding of what those patient populations look like, and have very big challenges in terms of presenting that data back to whoever the appropriate view is. So in this case, I'm just looking. This is a visualization of the ICD tree, the International Classification of Diseases, which is used as diagnostic codes in the practice of healthcare. What we're looking at here is the tree, and each of the circles are individual diagnostic codes, and radius of that circle is based on how over or underrepresented it is on what we're testing. And in this case, we're looking at the diagnostic codes that tend to happen in summer versus the rest of the year. And what we see is that it makes a lot of sense. We see for Seattle, we have our hiking accidents, our road, our vehicular accidents, our boating accidents, our bicycling accidents, our motorcycle accidents, our insect bites, all the things that you would expect to see during the summer. So only point here is visualization is a big open area, and I really hope more people work in this space. The other area that people spend a lot of time on that's also really important that has operational impacts for my role as CRIO is dealing with the hundreds of millions of pieces of text that we have in our enterprise data warehouse, like I mentioned before. And we need to be able to de-identify that text automatically and accurately. We can extract biomedical concepts that are present in that text or clinical findings that are in that text, or social determinants of health that are in that text, and do something with them, either clinically or for research. Many of these methods are machine learning based, and this is an incredibly important area since so much of the rich data that we expect to see in healthcare and real world data is buried in narrative text that isn't easily computable. An example, Mili Hayet again, who is a professor in our department who's focused on natural language processing and contributes efforts operationally to the implementation of fancy data things through NLP, has built a machine learning method that can extract social determinants of health from clinical narrative text, such as alcohol use, tobacco use, drug use, employment status, and living status like homelessness. And what we've done is applied that method and found that we can identify structured data elements that aren't actually structured in the EHR today that are social determinants of health based with a level of accuracy that is high enough that we believe that we can implement them back and potentially, if appropriate, present them to providers at the right time when they would need that information as part of their care. And that's something that we're working on today. I mentioned synthetic data. If you want to get an experience just how cool synthetic data can be, I love the site thispersondoesnotexist.com. If you go there, it generates an image of a fake person, a person that is not real. This is basically an AI-based deep learning method that can generate an image that of an individual based on a training set of individuals, and with photorealistic quality. And basically what we would try to do with synthetic data is just like generating these faces, but instead of using images of people's, mugshots, basically, we would be using, relational databases of clinical data. Why do we use synthetic data? Well, we think that we spend a lot of time relying, when we use real world data, real world evidence, on de-identification of that data. And I believe that de-identification of data of these data sets to a HIPAA standard using, say, Safe Harbor, where we shift dates and remove the 21 HIPAA identifiers. We think that that's risky. We think that individuals are likely to be still re-identifiable in those data sets without a whole lot of effort. I think large language models like ChatGPT are going to make this even more of a risk. And so we support building, virtualized environments that we control and manage, where we can present that data for data science or analytics to investigators quite easily at much lower risk than, putting them on, like, say, a secure USB drive or something like that. And we think that for a large majority of the kinds of things that we want to see for both training and for data scientists that want to, play with the data or build models, or build the tools to build models, synthetic data based on UW Medicine data will be sufficient for them to be able to do what they do. We've working with Brad Malin's group recently, we published a paper where we compared synthetic data. We basically built a model of the privacy versus utility trade-off of synthetic data. I highly recommend reading it because we also compare different synthetic data generation methods. And there is a trade-off between privacy and utility, because at the end of the day, we're trying to use machine learning to predict things about people, attributes about patients that we don't know. And that just by that self is a privacy risk, if you think about it. And so the more useful a synthetic data set is, the more likely it can be used to re-identify or identify things about a patient that you don't know. And we talk a little bit about how easy it is to get some of that data back from these methods. EHRs are going all in on implementing machine learning algorithms, real machine learning algorithms, not just rule-based data-driven algorithms, for a variety of different tasks. And health systems are putting in place governance, building analytics teams, hiring roles like chief data officers or chief AI officers to implement these sorts of tools and oversee their use. And again, lots of opportunities for study here and for helping govern, from a research or data science perspective, the implementation of these models and evaluation of how well these different models work. They're ranged throughout healthcare. They could be predicting things like missed scheduled visits, inpatient predictions like deterioration or sepsis, outpatient like opioid use disorder risk or diabetes risk or something like that. And again, how do we govern the implementation of these models and measure the value after, both before and after they've been implemented? And how do we assure that these models are fair to all populations that we see coming into our healthcare environment? Here's an example. Patient no-shows nationally, 20% of patients miss scheduled appointments. If we just look at our data set directly, we get about 14% of our patients. And you can do a couple of things to get patients to come to their visits on time if you predict or think that they may miss it. One is you can call them or text them or send an Uber or a taxi to pick them up and make sure that they get there. You could also do the airline problem, which is overbook clinics for certain times when you think there'll be lots of missed visits. And we took that data, built a model, evaluated the model for real UW Medicine data. And one of the things that we found was if we looked at populations we care about, the model is differentially accurate. So for example, if we look at annotated race within the EHR, we find that the model works differentially accurate on that annotation of race. And so that implies that, how we intervene to ensure patients get to visits, might have a bias built into it. And I think that that's something that's really important and justifies why this sort of research should be done. We're currently in the process of building an institute for medical data science. The overarching goal of this institute is really to get beyond the ROC curve, to implement AI and machine learning into healthcare and to study it. And really our aims are focused on building data sets that are useful for AI, along with the governance I've talked about, as well as methods and new methods that are useful, and to help implement those methods into care for the purposes of study so that we can understand the downstream effects of those methods. And of course, investigating new types of data, whether it be like Apple Watch or Fitbit data, or other digital kind of biomarkers or other things that might be useful. And at the end of the day, what we really want to do is improve patient health as well as provider satisfaction and the use of computers regionally. Just aside, just like this seminar series, we have a seminar series as well. We have almost 40 videos, I think, of our different speakers. It's all on YouTube. It's all made available. This is a great way to get access to really good, experts in the field that can be helpful in learning more about this. So how accurate are machine learning models really? One of the things that we have to do in healthcare, and actually we do anywhere in AI, is that we do what we call a self-assessment of these methods. And what I'm shifting now towards is we're building this infrastructure. We wanted to actually start by leveraging our data and building models and demonstrating that we could actually build a model. and then maybe do something with it at the end of the day. We're not there yet, but we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Self-assessment is hard, and implementation is hard. And when we look in practice, machine learning models are often overestimated for real-world accuracy. We call this a self-assessment bias. I publish my method that I presented at the beginning of my talk. I build an ROC curve. I compare it to other methods. I'm assessing myself, and I always want myself to have the best looking method. That's a problem in practice. We've seen this and know this is a problem. And one of the things that we do to overcome this from a research perspective is we've been running these so-called method community challenges. These are open source scientific research challenges that enable data scientists really from anywhere in the world to solve problems and compare the accuracy of different machine learning methods. We wanted to bring these sorts of approaches to healthcare and to research to understand the accuracy of how well we can build methods based on real-world data. So challenges aren't just about benchmarking methods. We can create new science from that, like propose new methods. We can propose new technologies or new methodology. We can hopefully get data scientists excited into building methods within healthcare. I think a lot of really smart data scientists or computer scientists don't spend a lot of time working in the healthcare space because it's so hard to get into our field because of HIPAA, because of challenges, essentially getting into the healthcare environment for the purposes of being able to do data science. I think that hurts us as we try to recruit people at the end of the day if trainees aren't able to get access to this sort of data or to do, have experiential learning in this space. We can help identify new methods that are superior. This is more of the benchmarking space, but it engages the biocuration or the clinical world to kind of help improve the data itself. For example, we might have clinicians review a gold standard or review predictions for accuracy at the end of the day. So we did an experiment with Sage Bionetworks and Justin Ganet, who's shown here on this slide. And this work was done by Tim Bergquist, who was one of my students, and Yao Yan, who was also one of my students, and Tomas Schechter, who was at Sage Bionetworks. And we developed a platform and an experiment that where we leveraged synthetic EHR data in Amazon in the cloud. And we created a synthetic extract of our data. We put it in AWS, and we created a platform where leveraging Sage's platform, where data scientists can manage models, machine learning models, also in the cloud that have been Dockerized, containerized, along with a workflow language that allows them to train and evaluate their models on this database of fake patients. We also created a mechanism by which we could train, like say a student, to build a model and submit it from their laptop into the cloud and have that model run against the synthetic data quite easily. And it takes only an hour or so to train them to do this, and it's quite easy. What we also did was we created a backdoor, and that is a mechanism by which we could pull those models down and apply them to our data ourselves. So this gave us a way of enabling data scientists to build and train models and evaluate them and technically validate they could do it, as well as we could securely take models and apply them in an environment of low risk, that in a way that we control it completely. So this platform was done in collaboration with the NIH and with Sage, as I mentioned. And this is a little bit more description of it. Basically, we had a cloud environment with synthetic data in it that could enable trained models, training models, and technically validating these approaches. We had our data, which was in UW Medicine, which we could then apply these models to. And Sage was that broker of models that could take a model, basically manage the models and also manage the basically how well models were doing when they were applied, and present both the accuracy and de-identified logs back to the data scientists so they understood how their models were working. recently, maybe less recently now, about 6 years ago, Google, Stanford, UCSF had a paper on using deep learning to predict on EHR data. They had a very good, what we thought was a very good AUC for predicting all-cause mortality, that is, patients dying from any cause over a period of time, and with an AUC of 0.3 to 0.94. And we thought that was a good way to test this platform, because mortality is frankly very easy to measure. We thought we had good, high-quality data of mortality, and we thought that this might be a good platform for us to, a good question for us to, demonstrate the utility of this. So we asked participants to predict 180-day all-cause mortality from UW Medicine patient, and we defined true positives as patients who had a death record in those 180 days, and negatives are patients who either had a death record more than 180 days or not a death record. And we had a training set of about 1.5 million patients, a little less than, you can read the paper, and a leave-out set for leaderboard, and then another set that we could use for future validation. And we invited data scientists to use this platform over a period of time. We had almost 400 data scientists participate. They formed teams, they built models, and we evaluated those models on our data. And then what we did was we stopped the experiment completely. And of course, we waited 180 days and asked which of the models predicted the future the best. We got RC curves like you would expect. We also got precision recall curves. The best model got a precision and a recall of about 0.5 each, meaning that it predicted about, if a patient passed away, it predicted about 50% of them. And if and of all of its predictions, about half of those predictions had patients passing away. The best model submitted was UW Biostats, which unfortunately, since we're at the University of Washington, this is actually the University of Wisconsin. Awesome team from the Biostats group there. And really happy they participated, and they did really, really well in the work in building models that were demonstrated. We learned a lot from this experiment. One of the things that we learned was that I think is really, really important is that models that are accurate at the population level models that are accurate at the population level may not be equally accurate at the individual population level or subpopulation level, perhaps for populations that we care about disparities perspective. So for example, if we look at annotated race for the patients that are predicted from these models, we see that very high scoring models are actually predicting at differential accuracy based on those annotations of race. And that's important because if two vendors, like say, come to you and say, we have two models and they have an AUC of 0.95, you really want to look underneath the hood and study them from an equity and a population-based perspective. I'm running out of time. I've got about 2 minutes left, so I'm just going to go through this really quickly. We also ran a COVID-19 challenge in the same exact way, where we predicted the risk of a positive test result during the pandemic and the risk of future hospitalization from a positive test. This was very popular. We had 500 data scientists that registered for this, and we ran at the end actually more than 1,000 models were run. We published this in JAMA Network Open, and we got a lot of information about how models perform over time. I don't have time to go through this, but you can read the paper and look at how accurate the models were and how the different models tended to work over time. One of the things I will mention very quickly is we did see evidence of overfitting from the models, which really highlights the importance of evaluating models over time. These 3 box plots, the green, orange, and blue, are based on the same, each one is based on a different model. Each of those groups of colors are based on a different model, and each box is different time points based on quarters. So the first quarter, the second quarter, the third quarter of the 6 months or so that we ran this experiment. And what we see is that some models tend to do well over time. They tend to about the same. And other models just get worse and worse over time, which suggests that this model was overfitted and the other model was maybe more prepared for that. So what have we learned? I'm going to finish up here. The idea that electronic health record data is unuseful for prediction and data science is, I think, a myth at this point. I think it's something that that a lot of people say that data is low quality, can't be used for data science, and I don't think that's true anymore. I think there's still definitely gaps and weaknesses in the data, and that we need to improve the quality of the data overall. But I think the era of using AI and data and clinical data is here. Data sharing is not always required to develop methods. We built a platform where we had hundreds of data scientists building methods, and they never had access to the private HIPAA-controlled data. And then machine learning algorithms, importantly, can perform differently on different subgroups, even if they are solving the same problem, trained on the same data, and are similarly accurate on the population. I think that's very important. And finally, even with rigorous multi-team independent assessment like we did, overfitting models is possible, and they need to be watched very closely. So with that, I'll just say we're getting ready to run a dementia challenge. We're really excited about it. We want to implement the best model as decision support as part of a study. That's kind of our goal. We'll see if we actually get to do that. But we've been playing around a lot with the impacts of what we might be able to do with such models. Again, this is very much in the research space and not the clinical space, but that's where we'd like to head to do, and we're hoping to announce this challenge relatively soon. So I just want to thank everybody. There's a lot of people to thank here. I didn't get a lot of time to talk. I didn't get any time to talk about the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center data platform. I think that's really an interesting space. I can come back maybe in the future and talk about it more, as well as the Kidney Precision Medicine Project platform that we're building to integrate multimodal data, both real-world data and research data, and study it in the context of kidney disease. But I definitely want to thank all of the teams and my collaborators and everybody we've worked with, and I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sean, for this great presentation. I know this generated a lot of questions, and I want to remind our audience members, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A feature of your Zoom. I have some questions too, but I'm going to first start with some of the questions we got in the chat. And two of them are about the same thing, so I'll merge them. How are you informing patients about how their de-identified data will be shared and used in initiatives such as All of Us? And a follow-up question is, can you say more about approaches to educating patients about using machine learning with their data? Are there best practices for disclosures yet, or have you studied how effective those communications are achieving comprehension across socio-demographic groups?
Yes, all of those are excellent, excellent questions. I think in the era of ChatGPT as well and generative AI, I think the answers to those questions are evolving in an ongoing conversation. I think there's a lot of really interesting projects that are happening in the bioethics space about how we should consider implementing, for example, large language models into healthcare. I'll give you a couple of things that I think we've learned. So first of all, I think use of AI should be transparent. And I think use of AI should be reviewed by a clinician and not replace a clinician, except in very specific instances where that has been very specific instances where the appropriate regulators have overseen and shown the efficacy of doing so. And so I think you'll see in the future, as a patient, you'll see a lot more disclosures of, when you see text, it might say in like parentheses below it, this text was generated by AI. I've been starting to see that more and more in non-clinical contexts. I think you'll start seeing that in clinical contexts too. So for example, if you go to Amazon.com now, you'll see a little blurb about summarizing reviews. And that little blurb underneath will say this text was generated by AI, assuming a large language model. And so I think we'll see more of that. We're an academic medical center. We do a lot of research in our academic medical center. I don't speak for the view of the University of Washington or UW Medicine directly, but as a researcher, I think we have the goal of contributing to the advancement of healthcare and through research, as well as quality improvement and other activities. we have a notice of privacy practices that says that data may be used for research as part of that mission of trying to improve care. I think it's really important that we give patients an opportunity to express their preferences about the use of data, and give patients the ability to opt out of the use of data in certain ways. And that's something that our data governance group is also working on, and other healthcare systems, academic medical center healthcare systems that do a lot of research are also working on. And I think we also need to work to improve our stewardship of data and how we share data through, for example, the use of, like, say, synthetic data sets. And we should also really, truly think about and understand the value of the use of data, and not just share data because we think it's important for some reason or other, without actually knowing what that value is. So I hope that answers your question. I think that's a very important issue. It's sort of evolving. It continues to evolve, but I think we want to be transparent to patients and providers about how it's used. We want to give patients the ability to say no, and we want to be transparent about the implementation and use at the end of the day.
Great. Another question we have is, are the University of Washington data sets available for other researchers?
So yes, we do share data as a standard practice for appropriate IRB approved research studies and studies that go through our governance process for data sharing. So for example, in the last question, someone mentioned All of Us. We actually aren't an All of Us recruitment site, but that would be an example of data sharing that might happen. In the All of Us case, I think all the patients are, again, we're not an All of Us site, so I might get some of this wrong, but I think in All of Us case, they're all consented with informed consent. So the patients should know and understand how their data is being used. But for individual data sharing studies, that does occur. But we prefer to provide computer environments like the ones I described, that we can grant access to data for use for research without actually sharing the data, so that we lower risks of the use of that data, improve our stewardship of the data. And again, also including synthetic data. I think that's really important. I think that should be part of the national conversation around use of data, is the better use of synthetic data, since it is much more likely to be anonymized or anonymous, because it's based on AI generated patients that aren't real.
There's a question about how to learn more about the dementia challenge that you mentioned. I don't know if you had on your previous slide a URL or contact information for folks to learn more.
You can send me an email. I guess I don't have my email on this slide. Yeah, that's funny. You can send me an email. An easy way to remember is just imds@uw.edu. That's Institute for Medical Data Science. So imds@uw.edu, and it'll get to me appropriately. And I'd be happy to share with you, what we're doing with the dementia challenge and what our interests are as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mooney, for this really great presentation. And I'm sure you'll be hearing more from several of our attendees. I want to thank you all for attending. In the chat, you can see more information about our upcoming symposium in March, the AI2C symposium that's hosted here at the University of Pennsylvania. So you can find out more in the link in the chat, and also remind you of our next webinar, which is scheduled for March 7th with Dr. Irene Chen from the UC Berkeley. So thank you again to all for attending, and also to Dr. Mooney, and see you next month.
Thank you so much.